I'm now going to call on Sam Ainslie, Senior Lecturer, Criminology and Criminal Justice, Sheffield Hallam University, please.
Hello, conference. This feels really bizarre. As an ex-probation officer, ex-senior probation officer. Well, I was about to say, first time speaking at conference. Bizarrely, it took me leaving to find a voice and get the courage to come and do this. Previously, I would have been sat at the back chomping at the bit to ask something, but maybe not quite brave enough. So thank you for having me. I'm going to talk to you about disjuncture, ethical stress and moral distress. That's quite a mouthful. I'm quite proud I've managed to do that after a 3-hour drive. I'm also going to be a bit like Chris Whitty because I have no clicker. So I'm going to have to ask colleagues over here for next slide, please. So I feel really important now. In order to talk about disjuncture, we need to talk about what is probation for. And I'm conscious we could have a whole conference about that in itself. But how policymakers conceptualize probation in terms of what it's for and what its aims are have a direct impact on practitioners because it impacts on what you are expected to do within your role and also how you are expected to do it. And what's on the screen is just 3 examples of changes over the time. Now, I'm not going to stand here and give you a really long lecture on the history of probation. I noticed on the way in, there's a fantastic display. So I certainly don't need to do that. But these are just 3 good examples, I think, of how the formal stated aims of probation have changed over time. So starting with penal welfareism, and I can really hear feedback. Can anyone else? Sorry. So starting with penal welfareism and obviously which was very much characterized by care and a belief in relational practice and in wanting to support people with wider issues than just those that have contributed to them becoming involved in crime, through to the really bizarre period of time when Paul Bounting decided that probation was a law enforcement agency. And that was just before I joined the service. And then through to the really catchy phrase of assess, protect and change, which is highly representative of correctionalism and this idea that we can assess people and then fit them into categories, plug them into interventions, and by virtue of doing that, we protect the public. Despite these monumental shifts in organisational ideas about what probation's for, probation research over time has time and time again shown the enduring value base of practitioners, and that regardless of how or when they've come into the service, they share this belief in relational practice. In more recent years, I think there's been a shift towards care and control. Practitioners do talk about public protection an awful lot, and rightly so, but they do still also talk about wanting to do good relational practice and working meaningfully and effectively with people that they supervise. Next slide, please. Thank you. But what happens if you can't do those things? What happens if you feel that you don't have the time to spend with people and that you feel that you're unable to do the things that you know are the right things to do as part of risk management? And Jane Fenton, in the context of criminal justice work in Scotland, talks about disjuncture and this sense that when practitioners are no longer able to practice, when people are no longer able to practice in a way that is aligned with their personal value base because of the demands from the organisation, it results in feelings of ethical stress. Alongside that, it can also be when, because of organisational demands, there is a lack of sufficient resources to enable you to do the job in the way that you believe it should be done. Connected to that is the concept of moral distress that comes out of nursing originally. And that's this sense of you cannot take the moral decisions that you want to take because there are insufficient resources within the organisation. That might be time, it might be due to staffing, it might be due to arbitrary performance targets, for example. The first time that happens, it's experienced as an initial moral distress, but repeat occurrences result in a moral residue. Taken together, these things can contribute to burnout. So the physical, emotional, and mental exhaustion caused by prolonged and excessive stress. Next slide. Burnout can be experienced in two different ways. Emotional exhaustion, so feeling depleted and completely wrung out emotionally by the work that you do. Or depersonalization, where you become very cynical and very detached. In the context of probation and family court work, that obviously has serious implications, both for practitioners and the individuals they work with. It can result in feelings of inadequacy, withdrawal, and an intention to quit the service. And we all know about issues with retention currently. I don't have time today to talk to you in depth about research that myself and other colleagues have done at Sheffield Hallam around burnout in probation work, where we did do an extensive survey across 2020-21 back in the then MPS. And if anybody in this room filled in that survey, thank you ever so much. We're very grateful. And that presented us with a wealth of information about the factors that appear to predict burnout in the context of probation work. And those mainly were around low levels of perceived organisational support, caseload, particularly in the context of how long you've been in case management type roles, the amount of overtime being worked, and occupational stresses such as the high degrees of empathy required for probation work and the degree of emotional labour. Female POs were statistically more burnt out than any other grade. That's not to say that other grades weren't burnt out. It's not to say that male colleagues were not burnt out. But statistically, female POs were the most burnt out group, which is something that I think HMPPS needs to take notice of, given the ongoing divide in gender within probation frontline practitioners. Our key message is that burnout is an occupational and organisational problem, and it needs to be a priority. Solutions which reside at an individual level are unlikely to be effective. So personal, individual wellness initiatives are great, but they are not going to solve burnout in the service. I don't want this to be depressing, but it's hard. My original slide said time to manage risk of harm, and I expect that most of you jumped to the conclusion that I was talking about the lack of time that you have available to you to manage risk of harm. It's absolutely right that we talk about that. Of course it is. But looking back to 1914, that's not a typo, Leeson was writing about the probation service. And the two issues that practitioners raised at that point in time as their biggest concerns about their ability to do their job were lack of sufficient resources and a lack of support for staff. So a lack of time and a lack of resources were classed by Leeson as defects of the probation service. If we fast forward to literally a few weeks back and outgoing Chief Justin Russell's comments, it's quite depressing really that we don't seem to have moved much further forward in 109 years. My final point, and it is my final point, is that A range of studies outside of the probation context continue to confirm the positive relationship between levels of ethical distress, job satisfaction, and performance. As levels of ethical stress increase, levels of job satisfaction and performance fail. So if HMPPS want to retain staff and expect them to be effective, I would argue it is time for them to act about the risk of harm that is currently posed to practitioners.
Thank you, Sam. Can I ask that Simi O'Neill now takes the podium. Simi O'Neill is from His Majesty's Inspector of Probation, Head of Probation Programme. Thank you, Simi.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for that warm welcome. So my name is Simi. I'm the head of the Probation Inspection Programme. I joined the Inspectorate in 2016. Prior to that, well, I joined as an inspector. Prior to that, I was working as a manager in the Greater Manchester region. It was the Greater Manchester and Cheshire CRC at the time, and qualified as a probation officer in 2004, having started training in 2002. And really interesting in terms of being able to reflect on that journey in terms of the quality of training and the type of training and support that was available, and how that's significantly changed and very, very different in what we're seeing at the moment. But what I want to do today, and it was really helpful hearing from Sam in terms of some of the impact of some of our findings from inspection, really, in terms of the themes that are emerging, some very similar themes around workload, some very similar themes in terms of the impact on staff and wellbeing and burnout. But I do want to be able to just touch upon some of our recent inspection findings and some of the recommendations that we're making, not only at an individual level, but more focused at HMPPS and the national oversight and arrangements as well. So between 2021 and 2023, we inspected 36 PDUs across all of the regions. We've rated 16 of those as inadequate and 19 requires improvement, with only one being rated good overall. One of the key themes that we have continued to find in every single inspection that we've conducted is the quality of work in relation to public protection and keeping people safe, and that the overall generally has been insufficient. So that means sometimes we do see some really good practice in terms of engagement, some good practice in terms of desistance and developing strength and protective factors. But it's that quality of work in relation to keeping people safe that often really impacted on the overall ratings. Some of the concerns, though, that we've continued to raise right from the start of our inspections is the obstacles in relation to recruitment. So when we first inspected, our first three regions were Wales, Kent, Surrey, Sussex, and East of England. And at that time, we really focused on the high level of vacancies, the recruitment challenges in terms of staff sickness, staff not being available. What we started to see then was a vast improvement in terms of the recruitment of new staff. But actually what that meant as we started to inspect the latter regions is there were so many staff in the organisation that had an increased level of training and support needs, but the service wasn't actually responding to that level of training experience that was needed. Management oversight or management span of control wasn't sufficient to allow them to have the oversight and the mentoring and support that they needed to provide with that huge learning gap that was in place. So overall, what we have found in terms of some of our recent inspections, we found that overall 67% of the cases that we assessed were insufficient in relation to keeping people safe. Some of the main things that identified the concerns that we were looking at were domestic abuse and child safeguarding inquiries. So in relation to domestic abuse, these inquiries were only being conducted in 49% of the cases that we inspected overall across every single PDU and region. Equally, for child safeguarding, where inquiries should have been undertaken, so there was clear identifiable factors, that was only actually done in 55% of the cases that we inspected. We shared those concerns earlier on in our inspections with HMPPS, and we know additional funding was put into place to bridge that gap in terms of not having the staff to undertake the inquiries or to work with police services. What we were seeing, although those recruitment had taken place, that whilst information was starting to be requested, it was the handling of that information. So it still appeared to be a process-driven activity, as opposed to what do we do with this piece of information? Various reasons for that. And that might be that staff don't have the capacity and resource to undertake the reflection that's needed to respond and act on the information in front of them. So in terms of the questions that we ask in relation to assessment, planning, delivery and reviewing, there was no particular element that was being delivered sufficiently well across England and Wales. And that's because we look at public protection across each one of those as well. This was the case in 62% of the cases that we inspected. We looked at 1,509 cases overall, and only in 3 PDUs did they just about scrape over the level of sufficiency. So the majority of still being insufficient. As I mentioned earlier, generally practitioners were stronger in engaging with people with people on probation. That included really positive evidence of them talking to them about their assessment, taking their individual needs and personal circumstances into account. But that wasn't always necessarily following through when there were discussions taking place about the risk of harm that someone posed and how that should be managed. To illustrate that, what we did find is in some cases, the level of harm wasn't always assessed as being the right level of harm. Often the gaps in information sharing meant the right information hadn't informed the analysis of harm posed, and therefore we were seeing differences in terms of the level of harm that should have been assessed to that was actually being that was actually being managed. Often the findings in relation to keeping people safe being insufficient related to the individuals that were assessed as posing a medium risk of serious harm. And we know that when they've been assessed as a medium risk of harm, it means that they can cause harm, but there may be some protective factors in place to reduce the likelihood of that happening. We know a large number of serious further offences do occur from those that have been deemed to pose a medium risk of serious harm. And that's one of the reasons that we felt that there was a lack of understanding of the harm that was imposed, and therefore an underestimation in the cases that we were looking at. So in our inspections of case supervision, we ask a range of questions at the assessment, planning, delivery and reviewing stage to determine whether there is sufficient focus on risk of harm posed by the person. What we found was the analysis that was not taking place initially, that all the information wasn't necessarily being accessed and available. There was a limited level of analysis of the harm posed, considering all and actual potential victims. And as previously mentioned, in the absence of sufficient domestic abuse and child safeguarding inquiries, it meant that there were quite significant gaps in those assessments. In terms of the independent reviews that we've undertaken, many of you will know that we've recently published the cases of Damien Bendel and Jordan McSweeney. Prior to that, we were also involved in Joseph McCann and other independent reviews. And there are some really difficult findings, but actually what we found within those particular reviews, although there were individual cases, those themes were emerging all across our PDU inspections. And I know at the moment there is a deeper look at those individual cases because of the inquests that are taking place. But actually what we're saying is there is nothing different within those reviews that we haven't already been reporting on in our core inspection programme, and certainly in some of our thematic inspection programmes as well. Some of the critical concerns that we did identify was, as I mentioned, in those reviews, was the assessment of harm being incorrectly assessed. And that meant often that the right measures weren't in place to manage the risk that was being posed. From April 2021, we started to provide an independent oversight as well of serious further offence reviews. So the inspectorate currently, I think quality assure about a sample of 20% of the SFO reviews that are submitted to the central team. In the last year, we've assured 86 of those reviews, and we provide direct feedback to reviewing managers and countersigning managers as well. In the last annual report that we published on SFO reviews, this is the second annual report that we've published. Again, one of the themes that were emerging is that the learning from those independent reviews and SFO reviews wasn't necessarily being acted upon. Mid-year currently, what we're finding is the quality of reviews have remained unchanged. So the majority of reviews that we were looking at, we rate requires improvement. This year, it's good to see that none of those have been rated as inadequate, but the learning is still not being applied to improve what learning needs to be taken from the SFO reviews, both at a local level, but then also nationally as well. One of the concerns that we have raised is the countersigning process and the ability for managers and reviewing managers to be able to look above their kind of team or an individual level in terms of what is the wider systemic learning that needs to be understood. And that's the why that sits behind the SFO review. It's not necessarily about pointing the finger at an individual person for not doing things or for not having acted upon something, but focus much deeper on what is the root cause analysis of that. But actually many reviewing managers feel that they don't have the confidence to raise those questions at a higher level. Some of those reviews are being conducted internally within their region, and that might then pose a risk for them in terms of what that means for them if they open lines of inquiries at a local level. So we are urging that there is much more thinking that is taking place about the wider systemic issues that impact on some of the practice issues that are being raised. We also found in our core programme that when we assessed the work to meet the needs of people on probation, the quality of work had declined since the unification. So when we inspected CRCs and MPS, we were seeing some positive arrangements with the implementation of the enhanced through the gate. There were some positive findings within unpaid work and victim work and court work. But actually, when we compared our findings from this programme to the programme prior to the unification, what we found is many of the areas have actually declined since the unification took place. I understand that those are some difficult messages in terms of what we are finding. We do talk to HMPPS about recruitment, about retention, about the training offer and spans of control for managers. And many practitioners talking to us, although they may report that caseloads are smaller or reduced since CRCs and MPS, staff are reporting to us that they feel overwhelmed by their workload. And that can often be because they are covering for sickness, covering for vacancies, or covering for multiple other reasons as well. And they're the conversations that we're trying to have at HMPPS level, that they must start to look at what offer is available, what support is available to new practitioners, but also existing staff within the organisation as well. Thank you for taking the time to listen.
Thank you, Simi. Can I ask Becky Shepherd, Senior Lecturer, Criminology, London South Bank University, can I speak? Thank you.
Hello, conference. Becky Shepherd, London branch. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about a research project that I've been doing over the last year and a bit, which picks up on quite a lot of the themes which have come from Sam's talk and from Simi's talk, but bringing a gendered lens specifically to think about it. And the research project has been on vicarious trauma on women in probation who are working with women. And this seems to me to be a Cinderella service within a Cinderella service in probation, especially since probation has been on its journey to butch itself up and be about risk and that kind of thing, that women's work can be sidelined, which is not to say that there aren't a large number of really, really good practitioners and managers focusing on women's work and out there in the trenches doing the work at great personal cost to themselves, because they are. But it seems if we think about what we need, we hear a lot about trauma-informed practice in probation now. And if we think about trauma-informed practice as being a healthy worker within a healthy team, within a healthy organisation, as what's required in order to manage the trauma that we get from client work, we can see that this is like the polar opposite of what we see in a lot of the probation service, and staff members are suffering under this. So as part of the research, I did some interviews, and another part, I did a survey. And in the survey, I asked the women practitioners who filled it in what proportion, like how many of them had experienced the symptoms of vicarious trauma, the feelings of burnout, the intrusive thoughts, the difficulty getting to sleep, the difficulty staying asleep, the feeling that the world is inherently dark and dangerous, so you don't want to let your kid go on a sleepover because you're imagining the worst, and you don't want to take part in certain social activities because you're imagining the worst, the feeling of guilt and responsibility on you because you can't help your clients, so you're still in the office at 10 o'clock at night and you're there on bank holidays. All of this is vicarious trauma. And those of you that were at the Women in NAPO Fringe yesterday know, because I mentioned this yesterday, 93% of respondents said they'd experienced vicarious trauma out of the people who filled in the survey, which is, of course, incredibly high. When I asked respondents how many of them had experienced primary trauma, because we're all not just workers, we inhabit multiple identities, and the 86% of staff who filled it in said they'd experienced a primary trauma, which is higher than the rates in the general population. And the trouble with doing research is when you get really interesting findings, it always makes you want to start more research because it's interesting. So if we have a more highly traumatized workforce in probation than the general population, what does that say about us coming into a helping profession? Because we understand what it's like to need help, maybe to be traumatized. But in terms of vicarious trauma, having experienced primary trauma is a risk factor for very obvious reasons. And if we think about women practitioners who are supervising women, we live in a gendered society. We still live in a patriarchy. We know the statistics about domestic abuse among women in society and the rates of sexual violence survivorhood that there is among women, and the gendered nature of poverty and the sandwich generation where you're looking after your parents, but you're also looking after your children or other caring responsibilities, and all of the idealization and almost fetishization of care and nurturing, which is very gendered. All of this is in the mix when we're thinking about women's staff. And I feel like the probation service preys on women's sense of obligation to their clients. And we talked about it in the meeting yesterday. These are not my phrases, but in relation to the probation service, some of the phrases that came up were, it's an abusive relationship between the probation service and its staff. They're gaslighting their staff. They're grooming their staff. These are strong words, but I think they're not unwarranted because practitioners are out there in the trenches, really, busting their chops to support their clients because they don't want to let that client down when they know that their clients have been let down again and again and again. And if they are trying to model something different and channel a bit of hope for their clients, they need to be the reliable one. They need to be the one who's there on the end of the phone. They need to be the one who's going to come to the breach hearing and try to keep that woman out of prison again. They need to be the one to care if a woman is not able to see her children, which affects many women who go to prison who are on probation. But all of this takes a very, very high toll of emotional labor on practitioners. And when I asked respondents what kind of support the probation service was providing for them to do this work, we could see, unsurprisingly to any of you, a real disjunct, a real mismatch between what was required to do the job sustainably without burning out, despite the fact that you're soaked in other people's trauma every day of your working life, and what was actually provided. Only 26% of staff said they had access to clinical supervision, which is obviously just over a quarter. I was almost surprised that it was that high, because when I speak to staff, often they don't have, and there seems to be clinical supervision might be reserved for high risk work. And with the amalgamation, what we're also seeing is women practitioners who specialised in women's work being taken out of women's work because they're so short of POs. They need them for the high risk cases, which tend to be men. So all of that specialism and expertise that female practitioners might have built up over years is that they're not allowed to use it because they need to supervise high risk men because there aren't enough POs to go round. And it seems also like access to clinical supervision has got some real unfairness in terms of which grades get to access it. Partner link workers, who used to be called women safety workers, who are supporting the partners of domestically abusive men, don't seem to get much access to clinical supervision. Victim support workers, who are usually PSO grade, don't seem to be getting proper access to clinical supervision. And if you haven't got anywhere to offload it, it just builds up and builds up and builds up on you. this is also, like with everything, an intersectional issue. What the research showed was that more staff who described themselves as disabled had had time off sick that they attributed to vicarious trauma. Racialized groups of staff who said they'd experienced racism in the workplace and hadn't been supported by the organisation, whether that was from colleagues or partner organisations or from clients. Trauma is intersectional and it overlaps and it builds up, and there's a limit to how much workers can put up with before they go under. And yet we see staff with that sense of vocation, which is preyed upon by the service, working themselves into being really quite unwell some of the time, because they're trying so hard to make up for all of the deficiencies in the service through their own labour and their own goodwill, which is a parasitic relationship between the employer and probation officers, I would say. And bringing that gendered lens into this in terms of women's work, I think is important, which is not to say that probably if we did a survey of male probation officers, vicarious trauma rates would also be very high. And that's research worth doing. Like I said before, you always want to do more when you find some things out. So what I'm going to do with this research is give it to NAPO so they can use it for speaking to the employer to try to argue for a better deal for women practitioners who work with women. I'm not going to hold my breath for that to happen. The employers are, thank you very much, put it in a drawer, and that might be the end of that. But we have the beginnings of some data here about a group of staff who need to be looked after much better than they have been so far. And I just want to finish by saying, after probation, I went to youth offending for a while, and I worked with a very, very traumatized girl. And she kind of adopted me after her order finished as a godmother. And that's 5 years ago. As I'm not suggesting you all need to do this for your clients. There's a particular set of circumstances. And she has learning needs, and she has a lack of support in the family. This is her 4th attempt at going to college to get her GCSEs at the age of 20. And she texted me, she just passed her first assignment.
Thank you, Becky. And brilliant. GCSEs. Doesn't matter how many years she got there. Sorry, I'm getting emotional. I do. Thank you for that. Can I now introduce Nicki Kenney, Family Court Section, Lead for Health and Safety, please.
Yeah, thanks. Helen, you okay if I stay here so I can look at my laptop at the same time? So I'm Nicki Kenney, co-chair of the Family Court Section and a member of the NAPO Health and Safety Network. I'm a health and safety rep and I'm employed by CAFCAS. Just going to put my glasses on because it's not so good. So I've been asked to address you about the NAPO strategy for reporting and responding to work-related stress, anxiety, depression, diminishing mental health. And all the information is on the NAPO website, which I've got open in front of me. So the labour force survey that surveyed in 2019 to 20 reported that 828,000 workers were suffering from work-related stress, depression, anxiety, either new reports or long-standing. And this accounted for 51% of work-related ill health. This accords almost exactly with the data on sickness absence in my workplace in CAFCAS. The data up to August this year, for the year ending in August, up to August, sorry, was that for social work staff, it accounted for 55% of absence, and in non-social work staff, so our business support and corporate staff, it accounted for 51% of absence. So looking at the NAPO strategy for what we say members should do, the first thing is that if you feel that you are impacted by stress at any level due to work or your personal circumstances, the advice is that you seek medical advice early on. You need to use your employer systems and processes for reporting that, and colleagues in the family court section will be pleased to know that our AssessNet app is going to be reviewed, because we've been banging the drum saying it's not easy to use, and we need a simple, quick process for reporting difficulties. So the third point in the strategy is that you share the information with your manager and you ask for a stress risk assessment. And that's the really difficult part, isn't it? Feeling that you're going to stand out, be singled out potentially. So it can feel a very lonely place. You need to reach out to your NAPO section or branch and tell us what's going on for you so that we can support you. The employer will no doubt offer lots in terms of the health and wellbeing strategy that they've got, and we'll all know about what's available to us locally. At the end of the strategy on the website is a letter which we used to call the foreseeability notice, which set out very clearly in a tick box template your symptoms, your difficulties. And it's really important to use that document because employers have a duty of care. They cannot ignore that. We've had some positive outcomes for people who've used this document or similar. You can write your own letter if you want to. And sadly, they've usually occurred for members who've already been off sick. And we're hoping that the strategy can be used in advance of people dropping off the edge and being off sick.
Thank you, Sam, Simi, Becky and Nicki. What I'm going to do now, conference, is take 2 questions at a time. If there is a particular question that you'd like to respectfully direct at any of the speakers, then please identify which speaker that you would like to respond. What I'm going to ask is that we go straight to our online and see if there's any online questions that have come in, please. No. And so we'll go to the room, please. Thank you, Deborah. Oh, yeah.
Kate Smith, London branch. Yeah, there we go. Thank you all. This was a discussion about when workloads become a risk. And really, this is a comment and a question to Simi. You talked several times about systemic failure, and you talked about the number of regions that had failed inspection. And that is a systemic failure, not of the region, but of the way the service is being managed. And you talked about the fact that in looking at SFOs, that sometimes the SFO reviewers weren't able to challenge their senior managers. But actually, that is still pushing it down. That is still saying to the individual, you are the person who has failed. Surely your job as an inspection unit is to be pushing it upwards to the people who are causing us to fail, where workloads are utterly unmanageable.
Next question, please.
Can you hear me? Yeah, Peter Holsall, London branch. I work in the Central Criminal Court, commonly known as the Old Bailey. About a year ago, it was actually quite a reasonable place to work compared to the rest of the service, because we got sort of we actually had more staff than we've got now, and we weren't getting as many reports. and as you can imagine, the reports are extremely complicated a lot of the time and complex. Over the last year, it's become more and more ridiculous as people leave, they're not replaced. The amount of reports has actually doubled, I would say, or maybe even trebled. We're getting asked for reports for all kinds of things. Even people who are going to get life sentences, they want reports on them. So it covers the judges when it goes to an appeal, they've got a report. If they haven't got a report, then the Chief Justices don't like it, and it reflects badly on the individual judges. So that's fair enough, but at the end of the day, we do not actually get the support that we need. I had a case a few months ago, and it was a really distressing case of child abuse, that the perpetrator was the father, and he just didn't accept any of it. And for some reason, it really sort of cut me up, because you do get used to these things after a while, or you think you do, but you don't. In reality, and basically, my manager's response was, "Oh, you need PAM assist." So a couple of weeks ago, I got an email into my into my email account, into my inbox, saying that PAM assist were available for me to have this counselling. But it's so long ago that I actually don't, well, I probably need the counselling, but there's been case after case after case since then of all kinds of nasty things. And it's just, it's totally inadequate. When we were a trust, we used to have, in London, we had an agreement with the Tavistock Centre, and we got weekly structured supervision with somebody that you'd actually had supervision with before, and you had a rapport with, and you could actually talk about things. And we used to talk about, you know, pretty heavy duty stuff, but you felt safe. I don't feel safe now. I don't even want the counselling from PAM assist because I don't know who I'm going to get. It's going to be over the phone. It's just totally inadequate. So it was just to bring that up, really, and sort of say everything that's been said, somebody needs to actually, well, we need to actually sort of say, this is not enough. You're putting our mental health at risk, and you're going on and on and on about SFOs and us not being able to do this and not doing that. But all you're doing is putting more pressure on us all the time. And I just wanted to say that.
Thank you, Peter. Could I ask if anybody on the panel would like to respond, please?
Does that work? Can you hear me okay? I hear you, Peter, I do. And I think there are some issues with PAM assist as far as I can gather. And I think PAM assist has its place, but I have concerns from speaking to people and from accessing it myself when I was still in the service in the later years, that the counsellors are often not sufficiently experienced in the kind of casework that CAFCAS and NAPO probation members are dealing with to be able to manage the trauma that comes up. So I went to a session because I developed a blood phobia after a horrible case when a young person had killed another young person, and the zombie knives were produced in court. It was at the Bailey, actually, and it was awful. And I went to the PAM assist service, and they said, "Oh crumbs, I've never come across anything like that before," which wasn't really what I needed to hear at the time. And I think it has its place, but it's supposed to be for staff to access about anything that's going on in their life as well. It's supposed to be a holistic add-on service. It is not supposed to be a replacement for proper clinical supervision.
Thank you. And I think Simi wanted to respond.
Is that okay? Right, yeah. So just to the initial reflection, thank you for saying that and raising that. I think one of the important things to say is, as an independent organisation, we don't report to HMPPS. Our role is to provide assurance to ministers and members of the public. And I know that we don't always present that way in terms of standing up and say this is wrong and that's wrong, but we do tell ministers and others what needs to change. It's not our role to say HMPPS should do this, but we will continue to keep saying something is not right or the right action is not being taken through the way that we inspect. And by saying that reviewing managers are unable to consider the wider systemic issues, that is not about the individual reviewer. We are telling ministers and HMPPS it is not good enough that they don't feel that they are able to look further and understand what the concerns are and why things are not happening or why it's not sufficient. Reviewing managers should feel equipped and should feel that they have the ability to look into those. But for us, that process isn't working. And actually, as Sam mentioned, since 1914, if the same issues have been raised, well, that is a huge concern, and it's a massive concern for us and our organisation as well. And we will continue to say that regardless of the changes that we're suggesting, the recommendations that we're making, it isn't good enough that the right improvement is not being made. And that's not about an individual practitioner. That we are saying it's not right as an organisation in terms of how people are being supported, the recruitment challenges, the lack of training and support that's in place. And that's why we're seeing what we're seeing. What we have to do is have a set standards against which we inspect and provide assurances to. We don't adjust them according to things that are happening or what the landscape is at that current stage within the service, but what are the standards in terms of effective probation delivery? We see it so often in our youth inspections, the majority of which we rate as either good or outstanding. And what do they have? Much smaller caseloads, far better multi-agency working and arrangements, a much more local approach to commissioning or bringing in services. And that's what that is exactly the messages that we're trying to share. And Justin Russell, before he left, did say in the annual report, more needs to be done about local arrangements. Thank you.
Thank you, Simi.
Excellent. I'm not normally accused of being quiet. I just wanted to say that I have a really emotive reaction when people share their stories like that. And when we were doing our burnout research, I actually got to a point where I had to ask, we do the research as a team of 4, and 2 of us are previous practitioners and 2 are, I guess, career academics. And I got to a point where I had to say that I felt unable to do the SPO interviews. And that was because my time as an SPO was so traumatic, particularly during TR and post-TR. My decision to move from practice to academia was not an easy one. I love probation. I remain hugely loyal to the occupation, but I am not loyal to the organisation. There is a difference. I consider myself to be in a very privileged position that I get to talk to practitioners as part of my research. I get to talk to PQIP students because I teach them. Increasingly, I feel like I am also counselling them. An awful lot of the time they book in to talk to me about an essay, and we don't talk about the essay. We talk about everything else. But the point I wanted to make is that one of the reasons I left was that I felt unable to influence from within the organisation, and maybe slightly naively, I felt that I could influence from the outside. One of the biggest frustrations I have as an academic is that we routinely share our research findings in a manner of different forums. We did numerous briefings to the probation reform programme with our burnout data. They are far more interested in what we have to say about professional curiosity than they are about what we have to say about emotional labour and burnout. And so we don't want to give up, but we have recently started trying to publish and present our findings outside of criminal justice, outside of probation. And we are now taking our work to publications that relate to occupational stress and occupational harm. And there's only so many times you can keep saying the same thing to the same people. And so I would just like to say that we have to, and I'm still using we, which you can probably tell that, and I noticed Becky did it as well. I think we have to take a stand, and it has to start being exploring what legal avenues there are for recourse for people in terms of the moral injury and the harm that is being done to practitioners. Otherwise, there's not going to be a service left to be loyal to.
Thank you, Sam. Nicki?
Thanks. Becky's research is our opportunity, isn't it, here? We must press on, use her research with all of our employers to raise the impact of staff, on staff, of what Peter's said. And it's the same for family court section members, constant discussion about sexual abuse in cases, domestic abuse, horrific situations of significant harm, to halt the messages that we heard in the workshop yesterday about staff need to develop a thicker skin, women need to man up, or we'll give you a break from allocation for a week or two. We've got to pursue it.
Thank you, Nicki. Can I just check if we've got anybody online with any questions, please? No, thank you. And we've got 2 people with hands up there, and then we're going to, we need to go to lunch, guys, so we can but we can keep going and going. However, we've got a break, so. Yep. Yeah, you guys know, I can't see you, so.
Sandra Rogers, Mercia branch. Sorry, I know other people have had their hands up, but I've had my hands up from the very beginning. So it was just a point, and it's a really quick point in relation to what Simi said about training. The current training is inadequate. It's online. And I had a meeting with PSOs recently, new PSOs, because they're told that they're going to be taking a different type of case. And they've had online learning, and they said it's a complete waste of time. We need to get back to face-to-face training. It's not fit for purpose, the current training for staff, and that's a massive problem.
Jo Thompson, East Midlands branch. It was a question really to Simi when you were talking about inspections. And what it feels like with inspections is that, rather like training elsewhere, is that it's about process. And which did you follow, and that you didn't follow it. And what I want to know really is whether you talk to practitioners that you're inspecting about what training they've had in order to do a risk assessment, whether their senior probation officers had that training, and whether their assistant chief has had that training. And when they've done an assessment, it's their assessment. Can anybody else just gainsay it? Or is it under supervision? Do they get supervision about their assessments? It's not merely about knowing safeguarding processes. It's about knowing how to assess somebody that needs to be put through those processes. So can I ask you whether you do ask people about what training they've had and what ongoing professional information, training, materials they've had in order to assess the people under their care.
Thank you. There's a theme there about training. Does anybody want to come back?
Can I respond?
Yeah.
Okay, so in terms of the first question, we have raised concerns about the quality of training and how it's being delivered and provided. In too many occasions, we've said that training shouldn't be online, and face-to-face delivery is absolutely critical and important. But also so is the space and the ability to reflect, and the ability then to implement, and for the right person to also assure that the right implementation is taking place. So has the training been understood? Is it being delivered as intended? Is it being implemented? And has the practitioner learned from that as well? What we're finding from our inspection inspection findings at the moment is the question to that is no, people aren't being given the training that they need. They don't have the space and time to be able to reflect, implement that, and therefore we're not seeing it in the quality of practice. And that's not just about practitioners, that's also managers as well. We're seeing so many people that so in answer to the second question, so many people say to us that the training that they've had has been e-learning or learning online, and actually that they don't often feel confident in making the assessments. Some people actually tell us that they don't have the confidence to ask challenging questions of the people that they're supervising. And some practitioners have told us that they're frightened of some of the people that they are supervising. And that just gives us evidence that they don't have the right training. It's not being implemented if they don't have the confidence to do that work. On the other side, though, and I reflect back to my training, I was in cohort 5. I was the last cohort that went to Manchester Met for our learning. I had a PDA, I had a mentor as part of my training. Our SPO, if anyone remembers, Chris Gwenlyn, was absolutely all over us in terms of our learning, and she would put us through our paces in terms of what we had learned. Our work was being assured and checked upon as well. That training programme should assist practitioners to go out and do the work that they need and make sure that there is ongoing continuous learning for them. That is not the case. That is not happening. And we're hearing that in the research and some of the findings that we've heard today as well. We are looking at our next thematic programme, and one of the considerations is, do we look further into the training programme and what that offers as well? So it hasn't been signed off, but it is part of the consultation. We will be coming out to consult on that programme. If you're able to join us as part of that and really say you need to focus on training, then absolutely support us, because we will then undertake that piece of work. But we do still do it as part of our core inspection training. The one thing that we don't do is necessarily ask senior managers, so regional probation directors or heads of service, in terms of what training have you had. Maybe that's a question that we need to start to ask and make sure it's part of that.